Okay. So I'm gonna start just by creating a little map. So I have this like Pac-Man image, and I'm just using this as an example, but when you're modeling stuff, something that's really, really useful is using an image reference, whether you're modeling, a cat or a person or a map or whatever it is. So I'll show you guys how to use an image reference real quick, and then we'll make a simple map. So I have a new Blender file. I'm gonna hit A and just delete everything in here. I'm going to go into top view, so I'm gonna hit Z. So I'm in top orthographic view. And I'm gonna hit Shift A to add, and I'm gonna go down to image and choose reference. And this will add the image into whatever view I currently have, but you can always rotate the image if you need to. I'm gonna go to downloads and get this Pac-Man image. So there we go. There's the map. And there's different ways I could do this. Sometimes I would like literally trace stuff with you could use the grease pencil. But this is pretty basic. I'm just gonna use some shapes for this. So let's get started. So one thing that I can do if I don't want to see like the full thing, or the full color, I can go to this image tab here and turn on opacity, and I can just turn the opacity down a little bit. That way I can see it, but it doesn't, cover anything else up. So then I'll just leave that in there, and I'm gonna hit Shift A, and I'm gonna make a new mesh, which is a plane. So a plane is just like a flat surface. So that looks pretty good. I can click on my image, and actually I'll scale that up. And then I'll click X-ray so I can see through my plane. So that's pretty good size. I might scale it later, but let's just start here. So what I'm gonna do is just map out the geometry that I wanna use, and then I'm just gonna use an extrude to make it into walls. So I'm gonna click on my plane and hit tab. Now I'm in edit mode. And so I'm gonna scale to match this like inner box right here. And then I'm hitting double A to deselect everything. I'm gonna grab these top vertices and then hit G and Y to move on the Y-axis, and just line this up like that. Zoom in a little bit, double A to deselect, box select down here, G, Y, and I'm gonna move up here. Okay, now we've got this little box. If we actually want to like recreate this whole thing, a couple really useful things when you're modeling, I'm gonna hit double A to get rid of that for a second. And then I'm gonna hit Command R. This is called the loop cut. And what I can do is, do you see, there's like a little yellow line, and I can actually, if I scroll, I can make a bunch of these. So I can make two like that, and I'll just immediately, I'll just click twice to add these here. And so now we can see I've got this little section here. I can hit another loop cut here and line this up like that. So I'm just moving this up here. And so now I've got this box here. I'll hit Command R again. I've got another loop cut. I hit return, or click rather, to say that I just want one, and then move this guy down here. And so now I've got this mapped out, and I can just delete the faces. So I'm gonna go to the face select. Oh, I need a couple more actually. Let's go back to vertex select. I need one over here. So just line this up like that. And you can see once you get used to this, you can do this pretty fast. So I'm just hitting Command R, moving this into place. And now I'll do face select. I'll get rid of this. So I'll just hit X. And then I just want to delete the faces. I don't want to delete the vertexes because I'll lose those. And then here I'm going to delete the faces. And so I'm just clicking on each face and getting rid of it. Okay, so now we've got that little box in the center. Let's go back into our top view. If I want this to kind of be rounded at the corners like it is in the original, I can go to modifiers, add a nice little subsurf on here, and let's turn up the level a little bit. And we might need to, we are gonna get like some distortions here. And so if you wanna fix those, what you can do is just add a little loop cut here and then just bring that up like that. So you can squish these guys up like that. You don't have to do that, but that's kind of what I would do here. So I'll just loop this guy. So I'm just hitting Command R and then just moving these up into these corners a bunch of times. Okay, so now we've got our little area. If we want to see how that looks, we can turn off our map. And we can see we've got this little box. You don't need the corners, you don't need the subsurf, but these are just, you know, kind of things that I would do. Okay, so let's make these other areas real quick. So I'm going to go into edit mode, and I can add geometries directly in here. So I'm going to hit Shift A and add another plane. I'm going to hit S and scale this down and match this guy right here. I'll probably just do this. I won't do the whole thing right now because it'll take a while, but I'll just do one more. Let me hit G and Y and line this up right here. You can see the subsurf is already getting applied here, but if you want to turn that off for a second, you can just click on this mesh button here. Okay, so now I'm gonna grab these guys. Oh, let's go to vert. I'm gonna hit G, Y, bring this down like that. Okay, so then I'm just going to do a couple loop cuts. One right here and another right here. And then one right here. Okay, starting to look pretty good. Let's get rid of these extra faces. Okay, then I'll add a loop cut here and add a loop cut here and add a loop cut there. Oh, and I need a couple here as well. Okay, so now that's looking pretty good. I have a bunch of shapes like that, so I'm just gonna duplicate this. So I'll hit tab to go back to object mode. I'm gonna box select this whole thing, and then I'm gonna hit Shift D, and I've got one down here, so I'm just gonna hit G to move this and line it up right there. And then I have another one right there, so I'm gonna move this down here. And then I've got a couple over there. So I'll hit D and move this here, and then R, rotate around. I'm not doing this exactly perfectly, but I can always come back and fix this later. Okay, and then let's Shift D, duplicate that, and R, rotate it around, line it up. Okay. Okay, that's not so bad. Obviously, I would add in the rest of these, and maybe I'll do that later while you guys are working. But for now, let's turn off our map. Let's grab these guys. And so I'm going to hit A to select everything. And then I'm going to hit E to extrude. And it's just going to go up on the Z-axis. So I'll just move these guys up like this. And so now we've got some walls that we can use. Let's turn off the X-ray view. And the subsurf is making these guys very, you know, rounded, but we don't need to do that if we don't want to. It just kind of depends on the look that you want to go for. Yeah, that's looking decent. So obviously I could do a lot more with this, but I'm going to stop here. I'm going to go to Object and Shade Smooth. And so we've got the beginning of our little maze. So actually, let's save this blend file because I've got a lot of stuff in here. So I'm going to go to Documents, or no, Desktop. And I don't want to save this in my main game folder because it's going to take up a lot of space in my Git repo. So I'm going to go back here and just add a new folder and call this Blender Files. And I'll save this as Pac-Man map. But now I want to export the GLB. So I'm going to go to File, Export, GLB. And I'll just include selected objects. I'll go to my models folder, and I'll save this as pacmanmap.glb and click Export. And I'm probably going to have to scale this once I see what it looks like in the game, but let's add it in and then see how it goes. So I'll go back to Godot. Let's make a new window. I'm going to make a new scene and call this Pac-Man scene. And I'll save this in my levels folder. And I need a floor, so I'm just going to grab the floor from this other. So I'm going to copy the ground from level 2 and paste it in there. Okay, that looks good. And let's get my player as well. So I'll find my player copy and paste. Got my player. And now let's add in the walls that I just made. So I'm gonna go to models and go to Pac-Man map. And it's very, very small. So let's scale it up. So I'll go back here. I'll scale it by maybe 5. And then apply the scale. So I'm gonna hit Control A, apply scale. And now I'll export again. GLB. Okay. So now let's go back. Okay, that's a better scale. So I'm gonna move it down just a little bit, and I'll have to make my ground bigger. So let's click on the ground and go to our mesh for the ground. And let's see. We have to make it a little bit wider, so I'll make it 40, but we're gonna have to make it longer, so I'll do 40 there, maybe 50. And then we gotta make sure our collision for the ground is the same size, so I did like 40 and 50. Okay, so now we've got a little map that we can wander around in. Oh, I need my lighting. Let's add our lights and our environment. Okay, but I can walk through these walls, so I don't want to be able to do that. Oh, I didn't apply the modifier. That's okay, I'll do that later. So you can see the walls are all square because I didn't apply that subsurf modifier. That's not the end of the world for now, so I'm just gonna leave it, but I'll have to remember to do that later. Anyway, I need a mesh for this, so if I go to my Pac-Man map, I can't see the mesh, so I need to right-click and go to Editable Children. Now I have my mesh, and so I'm gonna click Mesh and add a static body. So again, I could just make a different mesh in Blender, and if I added my subsurf, I probably would want to, because I don't need all that subsurf data. But for my basic mesh, this is pretty good. So now if I run this, I'll hit these walls. Okay, so that's pretty good. Okay, I'm gonna move this all down a little bit so we can see over them just for the demo. Obviously if you want like a maze, you wouldn't want to be able to see over this stuff, but you know, we can do whatever we want. Okay, so we've got our walls, so let's add in our collectibles. So I'm gonna go to a top view, and I'm gonna add in a node for collectibles. So I'm just gonna use a regular node and call this collectibles. And I'm gonna use an instance, so I'm gonna click on the link button and look up my collectible right there. And I don't know where it is, so I'm gonna hit F to focus it. Oh, it's right near the player, and it's under the ground probably. There we go. Okay, so I'm gonna lift this up a little bit and go back to top view. And so in Pac-Man, there's just like a lot of these, just kind of like lining the paths. So I'm just gonna make a bunch of these around this path. I'm just hitting Command D to duplicate and then moving it around. So this top view kind of helps for this, since I'm doing this, you know, not every scene obviously is gonna look like this, but in this particular case, the top view is really useful for just seeing this whole layout. So I'm just hitting Command D a ton of times. I'm not being super careful about where I'm placing them, so it's not as evenly placed as Pac-Man. If you wanted to do that, you could hold Control while you're moving, and it'll snap to the different parts of the grid. So that way you can have them very evenly spaced. So I'm holding Control and snapping. Okay. Okay, so we've got our apples set up. Let's make sure that works. So I'm just gonna run around and grab these apples. Okay, so they're all disappearing when I collect them, so that's nice. Okay, so now we're gonna add in some enemies. And this is where it's gonna get a little bit more interesting, but also a little bit more complex. So let's make our enemy first. I'm just gonna make another scene, just like I did with the apple before. So it's gonna be a very similar process. I'm gonna make a new scene just to contain the enemy, and that'll be like a component. So I'm going to make a new scene. I'll call this a 3D scene, but actually this should be, we can either use an area if we want our enemy to just like attack us, or if we want the enemy to like bump into other stuff, we might want to use a static body. So let's actually, let's use an area, because we're going to use the mesh navigation, so we don't really need to worry about that for right now. We can always change it later if we want to. So I'm going to change this type to an area. And I'm going to call this a ghost, like in Pac-Man. And I'm going to save this in my components folder. So this is a ghost. So I don't have a model for this. I'm not going to add another model right now because we've kind of reviewed that a little bit. I'm just going to add a shape. So I'm going to go in, add a mesh instance. And I'll just choose let's do a donut just for fun. I'm going to raise this a little bit above the ground. And let's rotate it on the x-axis, 90 degrees. Okay, so that'll be our little enemy. And we can obviously add in another mesh or any other component that you want here. You can animate it. You can do a lot of stuff with this. But for now, we're just going to have this big, scary donut. And then, of course, we need a collider. So I'm going to add in a collision shape. And for this one, I'm going to do a sphere shape. And I'm just going to move the sphere shape kind of into the middle of the donut. It doesn't have to be exact. It just has to kind of match so that when we run into this thing, it kind of roughly looks like we're running into it. So that's what I'm going to use for my collision shape. So I've got this component, but we're going to have to add some more stuff to make it interact with our scene. And that stuff is going to be a little bit more tricky. I have a script for that that I've been working on. That's pretty simple, but there's a few components to it. So we'll talk about that. So I'm going to go up to my main node here. And we're also going to have to add another component, which is our navigation agent. So if I click on here and type in nav, you can see there's this whole group of nodes related to navigation. And navigation is really, really convenient that our game engine does this for us, because in the past we would have spent all this time researching different navigation algorithms and doing a bunch of work just to get our agents to move around the mesh. Now with a game engine, it does almost all of that work for us. So we're going to use a navigation agent 3D and click create here. And so this is going to basically know where the navigation mesh is, and it will move it around the mesh. We just have to tell it where to go. For today, we're just going to make it very simple. We're just going to make it try to find the player, but we can add more complex actions to it in the future. So let's go to our ghost object and add a script. So I'm going to go into scripts. I can call this ghost is fine. I could call it like, agent or enemy or whatever. Let's call it enemy, because we might not all want to do a ghost, or we might want to have other types of enemies besides ghosts. So I'm going to make an enemy script and click create. And then this script is a little more complicated. I have a working reference that I created over here. So I'm just going to open this up to reference, but I'm going to talk about each part of this here. Oh, you know what? I forgot this whole thing. So we're doing an enemy, so we need it to actually be able to move around. So we actually don't want just a generic area here. We might use this later for some type of attack on the player, but what we really want here is a character body. So this should be a character body 3D, just like our player, because that gives it the ability to move, go up slopes, interact with different parts of our scene. So sorry, this should really be a character body 3D, and so we need to change the type of script to character body 3D. Okay, so now this is going to do a few different things that are a little bit more kind of physics-based, and so this is a little bit more complicated, but we'll talk about what each part does. So this first line, I'm just gonna, I'll rewrite this just so we can go over it, but I'm just gonna reference this script that I wrote before. So this first line here is just a reference to our navigation agent. So when I say on ready, that basically means it's going to load this reference before the game starts, just so it doesn't try to reference something that hasn't been loaded yet. So we have this on ready nav agent, and we're going to set this equal to, and here's where I can just drag this right there. So I can drag stuff out of my hierarchy into here. I also forgot to put var here. You always need the var or variable keyword when you're creating a new variable. So this has a few more components than our previous script where we're just making numbers. We're actually referencing a node in our character. So then this is similar to what we wrote last time. It's just a simple variable, but it has another little thing in the front of it at export. This means that it exposes the value to the editor, which is really convenient for making changes inside the editor. So I can say at export variable speed, and we're going to set the default to 3. So that's how fast it's going to move. But notice this at export adds this parameter over here in the editor. If I didn't have that, so if I take that out, it goes away. So we can expose any value that we want to the editor, and that means we can set different speeds for our different enemies. So I can change this number over here, and it'll update my script. I don't have to change the script itself. Okay, so we have a few more things to do. This is where it gets a little more complicated. So we're using our physics process here. This is the Godot engine is running a few different processes. One is just updating what we see on the graphics, and then one is updating its physics. So the collisions and where everything is in the scene, and it separates those two processes because it actually updates what we see at a different rate. It doesn't. It updates the physics faster because to have realistic interactions, we need to be calculating the physics very fast. But it doesn't update the graphics as much because the graphics can react to what happens in the physics like a microsecond later. So we're going to use the physics process for this. So this is a default Godot function that we can just reference. So we just say physics process. See, Godot fills it in for me. The keyword func here, we've seen this a couple times. This just means function. This is just like a block of code that deals with a specific event or action in the game. The other thing that you see that's a little bit different here is this thing called delta. Delta is a Greek word that just means change. What it means here is change over time. So this gives us the amount of time that's happened since the last physics process. This is like a tiny increment of time, but we use this to modify the action so that it matches. The game doesn't always run at the same speed depending on the performance of the computer. So in order not to have like wild jumps in the physics, we use how much time has passed since our last physics process to modify what's happening in our code. Okay, so let's go to the next part. So this line here, we find out the current location of our enemy. So we say variable current underscore location. And the way we get this is we use the global transform. So this is like where the enemy is in the game, rather than the local transform is like the scene itself. So we say global transform, and we say origin. So this is kind of the origin point or like the 0, point of where our enemy is in the scene. So we know from placing the objects that, if we look at our level, we haven't added them yet, but when we add our enemies, each one of these objects has like its local origin, which is where the mesh starts, but it also has a global origin, which is where it's placed in the scene. And so we need to know where it is in the global scene. Okay, so we find the current location, and then we find the next location. So our nav agent is calculating using an algorithm based on the mesh that we're going to add in a second. It's calculating where the next position we want to go is. So we're finding that. We say variable next location is nav agent dot get next path position. And eventually, as you write out the function, there's only a certain number of functions, and so it's starting to filter out where it is, and eventually we'll see that's the function we want. We just hit enter and we get it in there. Let's close this a little bit. So then this is where we're doing a little bit of physics calculation. So we're calculating the velocity. I spelled this wrong. Velocity is the change in speed over time. So speed is like basically how fast your character can go, but the velocity is the actual specific calculation of how much we move in one frame of the game. So we're going to calculate our velocity. So we're going to say new velocity. And to do this, we're going to subtract our current location from our next location. So imagine I'm, standing here and my next location is over there. What I basically want to do is figure out the direction between those 2 points. And that's actually quite easy to do. I just subtract the 2 points. So it gives me the difference. So I say next location minus current location. So that gives me the difference between, let's say I want to walk to that stool, but I don't want to move in one step because that would just be one frame. And so it would just be like, I'm just like snapping to the next position.
Question. What language is that? It looks like Python, but it is not.
No, so Godot script is quite Pythonic. It uses a lot of Python conventions, but it's also very similar to JavaScript. So it kind of combines those two paradigms. Okay, so we've got the difference between the locations, but we don't want to go all the way there. We just want to go a little bit. So we use this function normalized. That basically measures that distance, and then it changes everything to be between 0 and 1. So it basically takes the overall difference between me and the stool, but then it makes it really small, so it just is a general direction, not the full distance. So we say dot normalized, and then we multiply that whole thing by our speed. So if we want to move 3 units, which is our default speed, we're going to get that general direction, and then we're going to multiply that by 3. So instead of going all the way over there, I'm just going to go 3 units that way. So we're going to say times speed, and then, I forgot to use the delta. We should use the delta. Oh no, the delta gets used here. I might have forgotten to do that. We'll take a look at it. Okay, so let's just use the speed for now. Then I'm going to assign the actual velocity. So the actual velocity is just velocity equals our new velocity. And then we're going to use this function called move and slide, which just moves our character based on what we set the velocity to. Okay. So that's complicated, but that's the basic idea. Hopefully that makes sense. And then this next function right here, this just updates our target location based on the player's movement. And we're going to use a different script to call that function. So we're going to say function update target location. And this takes an argument, which is it's going to get from this other script, which is the target location. And then this uses the nav agent. So the nav agent has basically a target position that it's always tracking, and it's always going to try to move towards that target position. So we say nav agent dot set target. Oh, maybe it's a different, wait, what did I say? Set target position. Okay, and we're setting that to the target location value that we get. Okay, so this is our entire nav agent script. So it's a little bit more complicated. It will be on the GitHub, so you can just get it from there, but hopefully that made sense. The one last thing that we have to do while we are here is what we're going to do to update all of our agents is we're going to use a script that looks through the whole scene, and if it sees any agents, it's going to say this is where the player is. So they don't have to find the player themselves. One thing we're going to do to help that process is we're going to add our agents into a group. So in the node section, besides signals, I also have groups. So I'm going to click over here, and I'm just going to create a group called enemies, and click add. So now my scene will be able to find all the enemies by using that group, and it'll tell them where the player is. Okay, so let's go back to our main scene, and now we're going to add our navigation. So let's add a few agents. So I'm going to add a new node generic node just to hold all the agents. But I don't want it to be part of my collectibles, so I'm going to drag this up here. And I'm going to call this enemies. And I'm going to link a couple ghosts in here, so I'll just add a ghost. It's just a little donut. It's pretty big, but that's okay. So I'm going to hide this ghost guy over here. And then I'll duplicate it. I guess in real Pac-Man, the ghost starts here, but I'm gonna put my player there. So I'll put this other ghost right here. Okay. And I might need to lower them a little bit. We'll see. Or actually, I don't want to do that here. I want to do that here. Just gonna grab both of those and lower it down a little bit. Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So when you have the main part selected, over here in this node tab, there's signals and groups. And you just add the group. My group seems to have disappeared. Did I add it to the wrong thing? Did I add it to my collectible? No. Oh, maybe I added it. Yeah, I added it to my nav agent. Actually, that's a good thing. We don't want it to be the nav agent. We want it to be our ghost. So, yeah, we want to add this up here. So you can add multiple groups. You can have as many groups as you want. So I'm going to save that in there. If you have a group, it shows this little square. So you know that that was set up. Okay, so we've got a couple bad guys, enemies in here. And so now what we want to do is we want to create our navigation mesh. And so a mesh basically maps out the scene where the enemies can walk. And you can edit this, but it'll do a pretty good job on its own. So to make this, I'm just going to click the main scene. And I'm going to hit a plus and hit nav. And we're just going to choose a navigation region here. And we'll click create. And this is going to tell us you need a nav mesh. And so we can see in here, let's go to the inspector. So one thing that we have to do is everything that we want to be navigatable has to be inside our navigation region. So that includes our ground and our Pac-Man map. So we're going to bring the ground down here. We're going to bring the Pac-Man map down here. I could move this up. It doesn't really matter where you put it. But we need these to be inside here. And then we have to add our nav mesh. So we click on the main region, we go to mesh over here and add a new nav mesh. On here, you have a lot of options. The defaults for most of these are going to be fine, but you can make the mesh and then tweak these and see how it goes. So once you make this navigation mesh, you'll see up here, there's a bake navigation mesh and there's a clear navigation mesh. When you click bake, it's going to make a blue area, and that's your nav mesh. If you click clear, it'll get rid of it, and you can tweak the settings and get a new one. So I'm going to bake my nav mesh, and so you're going to see this little blue kind of like section, and hopefully, if it's set up right, it's going to match your geometry. Notice that it has areas on top of my little things. So your player can or your agents can go up onto those areas if you program that way. We're not going to worry about that too much. So a couple of things that you might want to tweak are the height of the mesh, especially if you have a lot of up and down geometry. You might cut through the mesh at various points, so you might want to lower or raise the height. So you can do that in, where is that? Here in cells. Okay, so here's the height. If I raise this, that's gonna look weird. If I do 0.5 and I rebake, you can see it's higher. If you need it lower, I can set it to 0.1 and rebake. Now it's gonna be lower. But as I mentioned, for most of these things, your defaults are gonna be fine. One thing is that you might wanna play with is edges. So you can see there's these hard edges here. Sometimes, depending on the size of your agents and other things, you might have some trouble getting around there. So you can go here and you can change the length of these edges. So if we set this to 1, now it kind of like, we see there's like a little angle here. So it'll make it easier to get around those edges. Again, I would always just start with the defaults and then play with them if you run into problems. And really, you might need to change the agents instead of the mesh. Okay, so there's our mesh. We just need one more thing, and this is a script to tell our agents to, walk around and do stuff. We're gonna add one more script here, and I have an example of this script here. This is a pretty simple one. Basically, it's just gonna look for the player, and whenever the player moves, or actually when our physics process updates, it's gonna tell all the enemies where the player is by updating their target location. This is a little bit of a more complicated piece of code, but it is just a few lines. So let's you could really add this script anywhere you want. I'm gonna add it to this enemies node here. So I'm gonna add a new script, and I'll call this, I'm gonna put this in my scripts folder, and I'll call this, what should I call this? What did I call it before? I just called it Pac-Man. Let's call it enemy nav. Okay, so first we need a reference to the player. So I'm gonna use that @onReady again, just to make sure we load this reference before we run the scene. Then I have a variable, and I'm just gonna call this player. And I'm just gonna drag my player node right here. If you change the name of the player, you're gonna have to update the scripts. You can see this has like a little .. because they're next to each other. So it's going back to the main scene and then going here. A lot of times people will add this script to the main scene node, but then you have to, you only get one script per node. So I usually avoid that. Okay, so now we just have a physics function. So we just say physics process. And so this bit of code is a little tricky. So get tree means we're getting the scene tree. So this is looking at all of the nodes in our scene. So we say get tree. So this is the whole scene. Then we're calling for anything that's in the group enemies. So we use call group. So this gives us all of our enemies. So we can add as many enemies as we want, and it's going to update all of them. And then we use this goofy thing called this is basically like, it's hard to explain what this is, but essentially we're calling this group enemies, and we're calling their function update target location. Remember, that's in the enemy script. And then we're giving it the information, this player.globaltransform.origin. So we're giving it the position of the player. So after enemies, we say update target location, and then we say player.globaltransform.origin. Okay, I think this is all gonna work. Hopefully, we'll give it a try. The enemies aren't actually gonna do anything once they reach the player. That part we haven't gotten to yet, but eventually we can have them, attack the player or do other things. So let's give that a shot. I probably forgot something, but we'll see what happens. Okay, so they're moving. That's a good sign. And it looks like they're moving towards me. So there we go. So now he got to me, and hopefully I can get away. And yeah, if they get to me, they can trap me. And now they're just kind of keeping me stuck here. Maybe I can get out. No, I can't quite jump high enough to get out of here. Let's give my player a little bit more jump ability. I've got some errors. It says I have an error, but I didn't really see anything. Maybe once I get there, I should probably check to see that I'm far enough away. What does it say? Navigation's map query failed because it was, I can't see this, made before. Oh, maybe I was running it before. I don't know what's happening. Okay, let's just ignore that. What was I doing? I want to give my player more jump, so I'm gonna double my player's jump ability. Okay, so now I can get out of here, and I can run past these guys. And okay, so now they're attacking me. So one thing that we'll notice, and we'll work on this more in a future lesson, but one thing that you'll notice, this AI is not very sophisticated. So eventually what happens is these two guys are just following me, and eventually they're just going to be stuck next to each other because they're not avoiding each other and they're not paying attention to other things going on in the scene. So that's another thing that we'll learn about is how do we make these guys do stuff that's a little bit more interesting than just going directly at the player all the time. If you play the original Pac-Man, you'll notice that the different ghosts have different behaviors. They're similar, but they're slightly different. They're not going directly towards the player. Some of the ghosts are going like behind the player or in front of the player to try to trick the player into, walking into one or the other. We're not recreating Pac-Man necessarily, but it's just an example of the kind of logic that we'll want to consider to make the game a little bit more interesting. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff, but hopefully it mostly makes sense. I'm going to update the GitHub right now. So I'm going to go to GitHub and say adds navigation agents. And I'll push this up there so you can see that. So you can see these scripts here. We have the collectible, the enemy, and we have our enemy nav script. I'm not doing a very good job at using normal naming conventions with these scripts. I'll try to do a better job of that in the future. But yeah, that's the basic idea. So we'll add some more behaviors like, they can walk around and do different stuff and then detect when the player comes around and try to make them a little bit more interesting. But we'll just get started with this kind of like basic setup. All right.